All the presentation is going to be in English. For anybody of you that would like to have it in Spanish, in the room beside there, there's going to be a translated presentation too. So if you feel like more Spanish today, you can go there. So what are we going to do today here? I'm so glad that Jacqueline is here. Well, I'm enthusiastic. I couldn't sleep tonight. It's like more than happy or glad. So because she was the one behind our foundation mostly. We have this foundation since we almost got married. We started without the foundation way of doing things, just giving money from ourselves to charities. And then we've been doing charities for a long time until we read an article in The Economist written by that woman. And we read the Blue Sweater book that she wrote. And then when you hear her, you will understand how we changed the way we were doing things before. Just a little 2 slides in what is Open Value Foundations. Our values are like the joy of giving. We started giving to the third world because we feel the need of doing it, and we were so happy, like, I don't know, like building hospitals or schools and everything, the old way we were doing philanthropy. But then Jacqueline gave us the idea of dignity. So the people that is receiving your help maybe would like to have something else than help. Probably they will like you be confident on their capacities. So that's what we start like changing our way of doing things. And then work or giving a way of living or create jobs is all of the third of our values. So it's the joy of giving, the dignity, and then job creation. We think that the best way to get out of the poverty is just having your own way of living and a job. And then freedom. When you have your own way of living, then you're free. And that's very important. And it's very well connected to dignity again. How are we doing this? So we are still doing philanthropy through our foundation, which is Open Value Foundation. But now we're launching a social fund, which is going to invest in companies in developing countries and social businesses. So we are giving first, then sharing our knowledge and talents with other people in less opportunity countries, and then we're being confident, so we're investing in them. And now I'm just getting straight to Jacqueline, because I want to show you this picture. Oh no, come on, it's not there anymore. We make the change. Anyway, she was in, I'll tell you the story. She's been in Forbes magazine, that you know is a very conservative, liberal, capitalist magazine in the States, but famous all around the world. And she's the only woman in 100 men that are like influencers in the world, and they say business minds, the best business minds in the world. So that's what she is. She's not never going to tell you because she's very humble, but she's doing a change. And the good thing about the picture, I will try to show it to you later, is that everybody in this picture, that were 100 men, well, no, 99 men and a woman, that is she, were almost rich. Their amounts of money are billions or millions for all of them. And she doesn't have any penny. Not that bad, but yeah. But not a fortune itself, which means that you can change the world and the way the things are done without money. So this is very impressive, and I'm showing you the picture later on. So I just want my husband, Paco, which is running Cova's fund, that it's really the one behind all this scheme, and that is from their management fee, we are getting the funds to invest in the social businesses down there in the green line. And just for you to say something about Jacqueline, and she will start her presentation.
Okay, well, I will be very brief. I mean, as Maria Angela said, we found out about well, Jacqueline, 10 years ago, when we came across in the Blue Sweater, and we have supported her and Acumen, his organization, since that time. Okay. because I mean we learned through her how to do a little bit in extra work. I mean a little bit more than just setting up a hospital and a school, which is really fine and nice. But we had a lot of doubts about whether that could be sustainable over the long term. And what they do in Acumen basically is try to go a step further, which trying to get return. I mean to invest. And try to get return from that, both social and economic return. Because if you don't measure how successful a venture is, then it's difficult to say whether you are being successful or not. And then if anyone runs out of money, then you will have a big problem. So we really saw that the way was the one they were traveling, and we have been supporting her. And now with the Open Value Foundation, we try to emulate what she did. And of course, we will still support Acumen and her organization in the next years. That's for sure. But we'll try to do a little bit also on our side. And I'm really happy and proud that Jacqueline was here with us today. I was with her in India last year for 1 week, visiting lots of the projects the Acumen is doing there, and it was a really touching trip and really enjoyed a lot. Unfortunately, I can only do that when I'm not working, so it means almost never, except last year. So I was forced to not to travel to go there, because really these trips are really enlightening. What this organization and these people is doing all over the world. Right. Thank you very much, Catherine, for taking the time to come here and to explain exactly what are you doing. Thank you. The floor is yours.
Yeah, why don't we run the video? But I just want to say thank you to Francisco and Mariana for that really beautiful, beautiful introduction. I mean, you all know them and the incredible just joy and enthusiasm they bring to everything that they do. And they have infused me and the team for a decade with that support, not just financial, but emotional. And the fact that you are now emulating and doing this work is actually deeply, deeply meaningful, because this is the way we are going to make change in the world. And to do it in partnership is, I think, what it's all about. So I just want to say thank you. And thank you all for taking time out of your busy lives. And next time I come, I hope I will speak in Spanish. So thank you for accepting me in that way. But that's right, let it go. This is just to give you a sense of us. So that kind of gives you acumen in a nutshell. I thought I would go back to the beginning and how we got started in the first place. I actually started my career on Wall Street, and as a banker was, do you want me to sit? Oh, I'll stand. And as a banker was sent to Latin America. It's kind of nice to have background music. To Latin America, and it's all right. And it was the early 1980s, so we were in the middle of a financial crisis, and it was really in Brazil where, while I loved the tools of banking, it was clear that the poor really had no access. And yet when I would go up to the favelas, there was so much life and so much determination there that it seemed really reasonable to actually bet on low-income people. And it's fun to have Karin from Yunus Social Business here, because I, 1985, heard about Muhammad Yunus and the work he was doing early days with microfinance in the Grameen Bank. And it's a long story, but I ended up in Rwanda in 1986, and I helped a small group of Rwandan women start that country's first microfinance bank. And there I saw that while markets have great strength in enabling low-income people, they can sometimes overlook or exploit the poor. And on the other hand, I'd seen how top-down approaches to charity and government too often create a great sense of dependence. And that what the poor need, as Maria Angeles said, is not just income, it's dignity. They need to be able to solve their own problems. They want, well, all of us, not just the poor. And it was really those experiences punctuated by living through a genocide, where I saw how human beings can tear each other apart if we start to get too far divided, that I decided to start Acumen in 2001. And the idea was that there had to be a better way to solve poverty than charity alone or the markets alone. And so we started with a pretty simple idea that we would take philanthropy and, rather than give it away, invest it as what we call patient capital, long-term capital, in entrepreneurs that were trying to solve social problems. That we would measure what mattered, not just what we could count, because that was so critical to really changing all of the game. And that long-term we would build a new ethos that we now call moral leadership, of individuals who were capable of navigating the gray, if you will, between markets and charity. And so I thought I would go through our model with you. But the very beginning of the model, and what's so critical to everything we do, is the fact that we stand with the poor. And that we live in a society right now that too often declares success based on how the rich and the powerful are treated. When if we really want to build a world where everyone has opportunity, we have to start with how the poor and the vulnerable fare. That means the way that we think about using our capital as a tool, not as the end in and of itself, the way that we behave toward each other, the way that we build our systems. So the idea of patient capital, as I said, was that we would take philanthropy, which should be where we see the most risk taken, and it's too often where we don't. We would find those entrepreneurs that were trying to solve tough problems in healthcare and education, in energy and in agriculture, water, housing. We would keep those investments for anywhere between 8 and 12 years, sometimes longer. That's a hard ask to a philanthropist, because we're such a short-term oriented society. And that when the money came back to Acumen, we would reinvest it in innovation for the poor. And our hope was that some of these entrepreneurial endeavors would actually disrupt entire industries. Well, 16 years later, and about 12 years of hardcore investing, we've seen that it really does work. Just before I get to the 3 examples, we've invested about $115 million in over 100 companies. Those companies have brought $500 million of more traditional capital into the companies themselves. So we've really watched these enterprises significantly expand, hire more than 60,000 low-income individuals, and now serve over 200 million people. So there's a real return in terms of impact on the dollar that's invested. We've gotten about 26 million of that 115 back to Acumen for reinvestment. And this year coming up, think that we're going to see much more as they're cresting 10 years. 1298 was a crazy dream of 4 young Indian entrepreneurs who had all of 9 ambulances and came into our office and said that they were going to disrupt the multi-billion-dollar broken, corrupt, and bloated ambulance industry in India. At the time, 2006, if you wanted to get to hospital and you were wealthy, you would call a taxi. 90% of people inside the ambulances had already died, and so you would call the ambulance if you wanted to take your loved one to the morgue. If you were poor, you never thought of an ambulance. If you were poor and rural, you would usually use a bullock cart, a horse in a cart, and probably never get there. But these guys were fearless, determined, and built a model whereby if they took you to a for-profit hospital, you paid market prices. If they took you to a clinic, it was free. It's a long, tortured story where we learned a lot about sabotage and corruption. Francisco visited. But today that company is one of the largest ambulance companies in the world. It has 8,500 employees, 3,500 ambulances, has taken 6 million people to hospital. But importantly, 75% of the people inside the ambulances make under the poverty line. By partnering with government, they've created a model that is highly accountable, that the poor trust. And in the state of Rajasthan and Orissa, 2 states, most of the people now are women, and the ambulance is one of the biggest deliverers of babies in the healthcare system. So it's also teaching us where we need to go next, primary healthcare. Ethio Chicken is a slightly newer investment. It's about 8 years old. We invested in these 2 guys that had this idea that they could do better than the government with chickens in Ethiopia, which sounds like a crazy idea. But at the time, the government chicken factories or farms had no chickens in them. They were mostly dead. The average Ethiopian chicken lays about 50 eggs a year. So these guys came in, and of course, this is patient capital. We invested about $1.5 million. All their chickens, when they first got there, died. And then they started to learn how to import parent chickens from France and from the Netherlands. They understood that if they sold a smallholder a chicken directly, it was too hard for that smallholder with all of the other things that a farmer has to do to pay attention to the vaccines, the foods, the medicines that those chickens need. So they built a factory where the chickens free range, but the chickens from Europe lay the eggs. The eggs are incubated for 21 days. Those eggs then are sold to agents who buy the 1-day-old chicks in batches of 1,000. There are now 2,500 of them. Some of them are making $30,000 and $40,000 a year. Those agents sell 5 chickens at age 45 days to individual farmers. And they're now selling 1.5 million day-old chicks every month. By our calculation, every year this one company is now injecting $250 million into the pockets of smallholder farmers in Ethiopia. These Ethio chickens lay 280 eggs a year versus the 50. And we've actually seen malnutrition in the region where they operate drop by 13%. So we really have seen, unlike the traditional methods, this way of building companies that specifically serve the poor can be remarkably effective. What's exciting today, which is even different, Francisco, than 5 years ago, is that we're seeing a new crop of entrepreneurs that are trying to change capitalism altogether. If you worked in the commodities like cotton, chickens, and certainly in cocoa, chocolate, or coffee, even fair trade practices would look at global commodities prices. That was your starting point. Well, with all of the transparency we have with the new GPS monitoring, our smartphones, we have a new crop of entrepreneurs, and we're seeing most of them coming out of Latin America, that are ignoring global commodity prices altogether. They're understanding what premium cocoa producers and coffee producers, what it costs them to produce. And then they're adding a fair margin, which is not like 10%, but 200 or 300% to their production costs. And they're locking in value because they understand poor people they want to have stability, not just income spikes. And to put that in perspective, the chocolate industry is a $100 billion industry. There are about 5 million smallholder farmers who are responsible for 95% of the chocolate that's produced. 90% of those chocolate farmers make under $2 a day. And so it's time to actually look at how we value the supply chain. And what's so thrilling is that these young entrepreneurs are doing that. They need patient capital to prove out those models, but we're starting to see some of them early days, but with $5 and $10 million with revenue already. And our job is not only to invest in them, but to link them to companies like Stumptown and Starbucks so that they can start changing their systems too. Having the capital, though, and even building these business models is not enough, because we're going into the world and saying, give us your philanthropy, we'll invest, and we'll have these great social returns. But as we see so often with impact investing, most of the impact investors think if I'm doing something good in Africa, it's impact, and then we'll do business as usual. And so we had to get serious about how we actually measured the impact. Smartphones, again, change everything, because we can now text 5, 6, 7,000 customers at a time from these companies. And we can learn from the customers not only what their income level is and how the incomes change, but what happens to their health, what they like about the company, what they don't like the company. So for the first time for me, in 35 years of doing this work, there's an alignment between the investor, the company, and the customer. And that's when I think we can start to make real change in the world. If you go back to the chicken company, a lean data front page of the 50-page analysis will look like that. If you pull that out, not only do you see the numbers I already talked to you about, the number of farmers that we're serving, how much people are earning in a day. An average smallholder used to make $350 a year, and now they're making over $500 a year. But we're also, if you go pages behind this, seeing real insights that we can use for policymakers, government, that during times of drought, which is important in climate change, the farmers will often sell their goats and buy chickens. 90% of the farmers are women. And so we're seeing, this is why you're seeing this reduction in malnutrition. The poorest farmers, however, we're finding from our lean data, often will sell their eggs for income and not feed their own children. And so there's a real conversation on the public health front as well. So we're just getting extraordinary data that's allowing us to play a role beyond building companies. That kind of data, after we build companies for 10 years, allows us to start imagining systems change. So then we go from just being an investor to really looking at how the world might be more inclusive. There's probably no sector to do this in like energy. And I just came from the COP23 conversations over the last few days, where everybody was talking about how we need not billions but trillions to get energy to everyone. But the conversations were all about extending the grid in Africa. Energy is really important, obviously. If you look at this chart, this is the amount of energy that a household would have. This is the amount of energy. This is well-being. It doesn't take a lot of energy for people's happiness to go soaring. In fact, I would argue it's much less than a kilowatt. We're seeing people with 50 watts change their lives fundamentally. And once you hit a certain level, our own well-being, happiness doesn't change that much. And yet 1.5 billion people on the planet have no electricity at all. They use a little bit of kerosene on a daily basis, and that's a situation in this day, 133 years after Thomas Edison invented the light bulb, that makes no sense. It's not effective, it's not productive, it's not just or moral. And frankly, it's dangerous. We didn't really understand a lot about energy However, 11 years ago when we made our first bet, and this is why patient capital allows that kind of crazy experimentation, these two young guys, who are now bald, to give you a sense of patient capital investing, they came into our office with a solar light and this dream that they would eradicate kerosene, because Sam had lived in an African village, and a hurricane lantern, a solar lantern, had fallen over and burned down his neighbor's house. So his vision was, we're going to help those 1.5 billion people with our perfect light. And as so often happens, nobody wanted to buy the light, they couldn't afford it, they didn't trust it, nobody had financing. So for years 1 through 7, we didn't know if it would go bankrupt or not. But over the 11 years that we've been invested in this company, technology has changed. The price of solar has gone from $1 to under 20 cents. The batteries have gone up. Awareness has been built. We've helped build that awareness. We've put about $5 million into that company. And they've now brought light to 77 million individuals across the world. In addition to that, they taught us how people make decisions about their energy. And it helped us then to start investing in other companies. In those same 11 years, we've invested over $20 million in about 23 companies, or now 23 companies, that went further than light and moved into household electricity, mini-grids, microgrids, metering. So we started to really learn, by being a laboratory using our patient capital, how would you build an off-grid ecosystem? So much so that a couple of years ago we got this idea that there was no way our patient capital alone was going to solve Africa's problems. But we needed to convince government that if you wanted to reach the 700 million Africans that have never had access to electricity, extending the grid, which costs $1,500 to $2,000 per household, takes the conventional wisdom is 9 years to never. You had to go off-grid, because for $200, a household could solve their own problem. They could have a solar panel on their rooftop. It would give them television and light and electricity. They would feel, as one person said to me, like they were in London. And so we've raised, we came forth with this idea that off-grid could actually be a destination. It didn't even have to go back to the grid long term, which is pretty radical for Africa, and yet the more we're doing it, the more we see the possibilities. We've raised a $55 million for-profit initiative where we really want to take $5 million bets, not $1 million bets, bless you, and bless you, still patient, still another 10 years. But in 1 year, investing just $14.5 million, we've been able to bring another $53 million in, and we've seen our two companies bring 2 million people full on electricity. So now the governments in Rwanda and Kenya, where we're really focused, want to partner with us. Now we're in conversation about tariffs. Now we're in conversation about jobs. And the jobs piece has been really exciting for me, and it goes back to your foundation and dignity and why jobs are so important, is that these aren't just, little jobs where you're weaving a basket. These are careers. And this woman, Evelyn, grew up in one of the most traditional conservative, the Ogiek tribe of Kenya, where no girls ever go to school. Luckily, her dad sent her out of the village so that she did go to school. She's not even gone to college yet, but she's been working for D-Light, one of the companies, and she's already sold 100 home systems. This is to truly one of the poorest communities in the country. And she wants to sell 500 before she goes to college, because she wants to make sure her tribe has full electricity so that they're not marginalized anymore. And she said, I want to build my nation, and then I want to build myself. And as a woman who grew up in America, where we always heard about the American dream, we were taught to build ourselves first. And I think that this is a moment in history where we have so much to learn from the developing world, where I'm seeing a new generation look at building others first. And it's amazing to behold. That brings me to the most important work in some ways that we're doing, because these kinds of companies are hard to build. Not only do they take courage because you're fighting a status quo, they take huge guts, grit, determination. They take innovation, and they take a lot of patience and kindness on top of it, because you're dealing with people who have never made these kinds of decisions before. And so not only do we find entrepreneurs who exhibit moral leadership, but we know that we can't do this all ourselves. And so we've been trying to build a core of young leaders around the world. And over the last 10 years, we've supported about 400 of them. Most of them are in Pakistan, India, and East Africa, because the idea was that if we took the same approach of patient capital investing in companies and we went to human beings, and we were very deliberate about identifying those individuals across not only sector, but race and class and religion and nation, ethnicity, tribe, that over the 20 years, these young leaders would become big leaders. And they would hold each other more accountable, and they would know their nations in a way that we are not seeing really anywhere in our world, not here in Spain, not in the United States for sure, and certainly not in the countries in which we're operating. And so this has been so successful that we're really looking at expanding it now to 15. But I just want to give you a sense of two. Shamea Akhtar is a young woman who grew up in a Balochi tribe in a village outside of Mirpurkhas, and anyone who knows Pakistan knows that that's like really far away, in the middle of the Sindh desert, where you never see a woman. They're all in purdah. Again, in the randomness of our lives and who gets what. She had an uncle who went to university, and when her father was fully devastated that she was born a girl, the uncle said, well, maybe we can fix that. Let's just raise her as a boy. And so at age 3 months, they dressed her as the boy. They treated her as a boy inside the house and outside the house. And they sent her to school at great risk, because had she been caught, the family would have not only been ostracized, but she may have been killed in an honor killing. She tells the story like nobody, and it's a long story, but somehow this fierce young boy-girl who stands like a boy, I feel kind of jealous because she's so fierce, is now finishing her PhD. After being an Acumen Fellow, she decided she was too privileged working at the nonprofit she worked at, so she quit and now takes a bus 2 hours each way to go to an even more rural village where she is teaching all of the girls in the schools, and all the girls in her village go to school as she is completing her PhD. It's the kind of young person that we're talking about. And Mariana, you talked about freedom. Teresa Njoroge is another fellow from Kenya who was a banker accused of a crime she didn't commit, put into jail for a year with her 3-month-old child, and refused to let anybody take her real freedom away from her, got out of jail, and has started an organization called Clean Start to transition people into society and to take on the criminal justice system. Because she's part of this community of acumen companies that are getting more powerful, of other fellows, and of our donors, not only is the community helping her with training, mentoring, clothes, jobs, but she's becoming very fierce. And as she says, I stand as one, but I come as 10,000. And because so many young people around the world now want to do this work in every country, we were overwhelmed with the amount of applications we got. And so we decided, what if we took some of the lessons that we have learned and put it online? Would anybody want to look at it? And we've had over 500,000 people now take our courses in 193 countries. The most recently was Tuvalu, of young and old who are taking courses on everything from design at the bottom of the pyramid to storytelling to what is a social enterprise. And we really are serious about creating movement. That is why we are here. It's why we're a nonprofit, even though we're emerging as a series of for-profit and nonprofit funds. But what we understand is that it really comes down to people, leadership, seeing capital as a tool, not as an end, and changing the narrative of who we are on earth for and with each other. We know that in this new interdependent world, The old rules that had us more divided aren't working anymore. We cannot build a society based on the primacy of the shareholder as our singular rule. We've got to be thinking about stakeholders. We've got to be more patient. We've got to be measuring impact, both positive and negative, not only on the poor but on the earth. And we know that we don't have those roadmaps yet. And so we created a manifesto, which was our best shot at giving a value system to the people in our community. And if you'll just indulge me, I'll read it because I think it really wraps up everything that we do. It starts by standing with the poor, listening to voices unheard, recognizing potential where others see despair. It demands investing as a means, not an end, daring to go where markets have failed and aid has fallen short. It makes capital work for us, not control us. It thrives on moral imagination, the humility to see the world as it is, the audacity to imagine it as it could be. It's having the ambition to learn at the edge, the wisdom to admit failure, the courage to start again. It requires patience and kindness, resilience and grit, a hard-edged hope. It's leadership that rejects complacency, breaks through bureaucracy, challenges corruption, doing what's right, not what's easy. It's the radical idea of creating hope in a cynical world, changing the way the world tackles poverty, and building a world based on dignity. Like Maria Angeles said, it all comes down to dignity. These are faces of 3 of our customers, and they remind me daily that every single day, those of us who are so privileged use things that are serviced and built by individuals all across the world that we never think about, that we might not know, but that want to be part of the world just like we do. And this idea of dignity really is an idea of freedom, that we have to think about poverty not as anything but a description of one's economic condition. It certainly says nothing about our character. In my life, the greatest privilege has been to meet our customers, our entrepreneurs, our partners, and see a common yearning to be counted, to be seen, to be part of each other. And what's so crazy is we have the opportunity. We actually know how to solve all of our problems. As long as we stop the bifurcation of I make money here, I give it away there, and we find ways to develop more integrated human moral systems in which we can all count. And so that's the dream, that's the journey, and I feel like we're just getting started. So thanks for coming again tonight.
So now we will have some time for questions. If you want to make a question, raise your hand. In the meantime, where you think, what are you going to question? Jacqueline, I'll do my ones. You can do them in Spanish if you feel better, and I can translate them, so feel free, okay? So, Jacqueline, regarding patient capital, I got to know a little bit there, but how long is patient? My husband can say something about it too.
Well, as I said to Maria, when I'm starting to look at these photographs, I feel like, you know, from hair to bald or dark to gray seems to be the patient capital. We thought that it was earlier, but like 7 or 8 years. But what I think we've come to understand is that we are creating markets that never existed before. And so when we used to talk about the status quo, that's an easy phrase to throw around and young people love it, but it's real. The reason that it was so hard to get solar electricity into people's homes, particularly in places like India and Nigeria, is because the diesel mafias and the kerosene mafias would move the solar off the shelves. They would threaten you. There was no financing. And so these entrepreneurs are having to find ways to solve infrastructure problems, bureaucratic problems, corruption problems, things that we just didn't really think about. And that doesn't happen in 5 or 7 years. It really is more like 10 or 12 and sometimes 15 years, which sounds long looking forward, But when you look back, it goes like that. And when you see 100 million people have not just access, but have stepped with their feet, and they have light and electricity, then it's worth every minute of it.
In your experience, does there need to be a trade-off between social and financial return?
It's a complicated question. If you're investing in Tesla, no. You can get a lot of social impact and a lot of financial return. If you are trying to bring, as we have, safe drinking water to rural India, and you are fighting everything, including the fact that your customer makes $2 a day, yes. It depends on what you are trying to do with your capital, and it's why the social impact metrics become so important.
How do you define a social business? We've seen some of them already, so.
Well, for us, yeah, you've seen it for us, and I think this is also, it's a long conversation in this impact investing space that is really very new, so it's not that sophisticated in truth. So you do see funds that are invested in Tesla and say, we're social investors, we invest in social businesses, and then there are those that are like Acumen and say, we're social investors, and so for us, our lens is poverty. Our lens is people who are living under the poverty line, and therefore the kind of patient capital that we require for early stage is not going to see the kind of financial returns that people who are investing in the late stage might get. And my dream, Maria Angeles, is that we begin to segment this space so not everybody is a social business, but that we recognize that there are those entrepreneurs who are trying to solve social problems, and specifically social problems of poverty, and then we let the capital follow in ways that are much more intelligent than we've seen historically. It's not just corruption in governments. You know, everyone's in the game. So it's in a way that goes to the whole moral leadership piece, because what we really need is an entrepreneur that will tell us the truth. In the case of the ambulance company, we probably learned more about extortion, speed money, sabotage than I ever wanted to learn in my life. And the way we started fighting it was more naive. I just didn't understand that there was so much political power, and of course there was. If it's a multi-billion-dollar industry, that there are mafia guys that can throw a strike with employees in your companies because they're in the political party that you belong to. And so the beginning was just not to panic. When I first started and suddenly our company was in the national news for having a labor strike, I was like, oh my God. Now it's like, yeah, tell me, who's behind it? Help me understand. So first is just, again, having the patience to understand the issue. Second was, because we're patient capital, when government officials will hold up payment until they get a bribe, you can actually float working capital so that they don't, you let them hold up the payment, so you play their game. We got a lucky break in the ambulance company because a sub-minister finally got so frustrated that we were playing ball, but not playing corruption, that he called the CEO and really tried to extort her, not thinking that in an ambulance company, every call is recorded. And so we, so that was pretty exciting. So I think it's really, we take it on. we are in a privileged position as well. We are backed a lot more time, a lot more money. And the other thing I would say to that is there's the humility of having the conversations with entrepreneurs, because their friends who are in the same sectors are getting famous and rich by doing what's easy. And we are asking them, demanding of them to do what's right. And it can feel humiliating at times. We were talking about an entrepreneur who did housing in Pakistan, which is a really corrupt industry, never paid a bribe. But for the first 2 years, he also never got his land registered. But every time I got on a stage in Pakistan, I would say, we have this great land, we can't get it registered because there's this 39-year-old who insists on a bribe. And finally, the Minister of Housing set up a unit in the housing department so people could bypass the local registrars. But for those 2 years, I had a sometimes tearful entrepreneur on the end of the line. So I think it's the time, it's money, it's accompaniment. And I don't think we have enough of that.
Un segundo, cuando levanten la mano y les entrego el micrófono, porque en el streaming hay gente en internet que está escuchando también, entonces quieren escuchar la pregunta.
So thank you, Jacqueline. Congrats. So you just mentioned that your focus is on developing world and on poverty. So my question, since we are in Spain and in Europe, how do you see impact investment in developed world, in Spain, in Europe, in the US? What's your view on this? Thank you.
So it's a great question, and I actually didn't say the developing world, I said poverty. And the reason that's important is that 5 or 6 years ago, when we were looking at expanding, right now we're in Pakistan, India, East Africa, West Africa, we said we're next. And it would have been easier in some ways to go to Southern Africa or to Central Asia. But we decided that we didn't understand enough about the poverty of inequality. And so we went to Latin America, Colombia and Peru. And then 3 years ago, went to the United States. The United States has been a real journey for us, because not only are we seeing the poverty of inequality, but in many areas we're seeing absolute poverty levels that are consistent or worse than we're seeing in parts of India. And yet we're seeing entrepreneurs with the same level of passion and capability. What's exciting with the new technologies is in Harlem we have a woman who's building a company with community health workers. She's being mentored by our entrepreneur in southern India, who's already built a huge system, and he talks to her on a weekly basis via Skype. And so it's really helping us see that we can build this community across the world where you can find innovation wherever it is and bring it to other parts. So part of the dream, and this is also with the courses, is that we'll see more and more social entrepreneurs in whatever country they're in focusing on building solutions and tapping into the collective wisdom of others around the world.
I have a question on how you work with the entrepreneurs, because you say you have people on the phone basically, so you are with the entrepreneurs. Do you have them people on the ground working also with the entrepreneurs, especially when they face challenges like government, corruption, which is something difficult to do from remote, obviously?
So we have teams on the ground in Karachi, Mumbai, Accra, Nairobi, Bogota, San Francisco. I'm probably forgetting somewhere. And those teams, which are all local, we don't have any expats at Acumen, are surrounded by the business community. So if you go to Pakistan, which is where we've just done a partner trip, there are probably 300 members of the Acumen community that either give, mentor, or are on our team. And we have 120 fellows. So there's a rich community on the ground. You're right. When there's an issue, like with the housing, it was really a guy named Zubair Sumro, who was the head of Citibank, that helped Javad Aslam, the entrepreneur, navigate the politics to solve his problems. And we've just exited, and he has just, he's now the only successful for-profit mortgage company for the poor in Pakistan. And when he talked to us, it was somewhat humbling. He said, you know, the money was great, the fellows were amazing, but it was the people you connected us to that really enabled us to succeed.
Hi, Jacqueline. I would like to ask you if you could explain us how are you reporting your investors? I presume that in terms of social return and in terms of financial return, perhaps?
So
Thank you.
we do a partner gathering once a year where we try to make that be an accounting of both our successes and our failures. And we've gotten better. I mean, Mariana Anales and Francisco could speak to it. Ourselves, I don't think we were as good at the beginning because we didn't really have great systems for our metrics. We are coming out with a report, hopefully, before the year is over, on energy, because now we've invested in all those energy companies. With our impact, we can now not only show you on a company-by-company basis, although we don't have names on the companies because they're private companies, but if you're partners, you can find out. On a company-by-company basis, not only how are they doing financially, but on the poverty, on the carbon displacement, so for climate change, and now we're able to compare the companies across the sector. And so that is the most hopeful to us in terms of how an investor like Francisco would allocate capital based on his own goals. And so I'd say it's a work in progress. Where I want us to get even stronger is when we exit a company, really pulling out not only the financials and the impact, but what have been the lessons learned, because they've been so rich. And sometimes you're so focused on just making these companies work, you let those lessons go, and I think we can do more on that front.
Hi, Jacqueline. Thanks very much for this wonderful presentation. It was really inspiring. My question is, you know, we've seen a recent trend of traditional asset managers getting into the impact investing space, and I wanted to ask you if you see any kind of threat coming from this, maybe, from a potential mission drift that these traditional asset managers may bring. And this is not the case of Cobas because it's all coming from their foundation, but we've seen other traditional asset managers getting into the space, and maybe that's going to, you know, change a little bit the social mission.
It's a great question. Right now, I feel it's all good that so many are coming in. I do think that there's risk of greenwashing, which is what people are getting really frightened of, that everyone's calling themselves impact investing now. And I'm often meeting people now that say, you know, I want to solve poverty with my portfolio, but I want market returns. It's like, we are living at the time of the greatest inequality in our lifetime. You have more money than anybody, and now you want to work on the poorest people and get market returns. You know, that's been happening forever with the mafias. They get above market returns. But if we really want to solve the problems, we need to be a bit more nuanced and flexible. And so that conversation, I think, is somewhat risky. I find it exciting because I feel like there are more people that are coming in. The bigger conversation that we're in now, and I had 3 of them yesterday, was people come in, they want to make impact investments, but they want commercially viable entities. So they don't have any pipeline. And so they'll come to us and say, can you build pipeline for us? And we'll say, well, then can you give us philanthropy to build the pipeline? And they'll say, well, no, because we want to have the investments. And so that's a chicken and an egg. So this is where, again, my hope is, can there be greater segmentation? Then I think there's room for everybody. But this side, the early stage, high risk, often low return, sweet spot of the market, for some reason, doesn't get a lot of investing. And it's needed.
Okay, I guess what I'm particularly interested in is situations where entrepreneurs in places like India, Pakistan, and East Africa have developed things that make our lives better in this part of the world. So I'm interested always in, because sometimes when people have less resources, first of all, their creations are more innovative, and second of all, they're more sustainable. So I'm interested, have there been any cases where anything any entrepreneurs have done have come all the way, say, to the States or to Europe, or is that something that you're even watching, or would you be surprised if it happened?
Oh, for sure, it's already happening. I mean, this example of the community health worker, which is really a phenomenon that has come out of Africa, where individuals from the community are trained in basic health care. They're not doctors, but they are certainly capable of administering simple medicines, taking tests, ensuring that they really came out of HIV, when people needed to take you had to eat to take your antiretrovirals so that they would be effective. And so it was essentially a legion of women that would, knock on your door and make sure you were doing what you need to do. City Health Works, which is based in Harlem, is taking that model into the United States. And it's been thrilling for me to go from Africa, where we have them, India, where we have them, and then Harlem, because I'm meeting people in Harlem who used to work in McDonald's, and now they are they're health workers, and they're teaching their neighbors, but also their family members, how to stay out of hospital, how to eat well, how to shop at the green grocer. The revenue model for the company is that insurance and Obamacare, or whatever it's called now, by reducing the cost to government, they're getting a revenue stream because people are staying healthier. And so the company has a revenue base. The health workers feel like they are contributing to their community. They also have the same issues, frankly, that the people they're serving have. And it all comes from the developing world. So I think we're going to see more and more of that. As you said, innovation in resource-scarce environments is going to end up being what the whole world needs. And that thrills me.
Hi, Jacqueline. Thank you for coming and inspiring us.
Oh, there you are. Thank you.
I would like to ask you how you target these final users, which are the social entrepreneurs that work in the emerging economies, that they are creating this value and impact for their communities. So when you try to find a new country, new market, how you make connections with local communities, or how do you expand your acumen in new projects?
On the investing side, we're not looking to expand geographically so much, because we're starting to see that our ethos, we can expand our ethos more easily. And in fact, that's why we're looking at expanding the fellows work. And with the fellows expansion, we're using a good old Jesuit model, whereby we're taking existing fellows who've already been inculcated with the values of acumen. They're part of the community. They know what is expected of them. And I frankly don't care where they go, because they will succeed. And so next year we'll probably expand our fellows program to Bangladesh, Malaysia, Colombia for sure, maybe one other region, because we've got fellows from those regions that want to bring those programs. My bet is that will then result in these kinds of funds that Francisco and Maria Angeles are doing. That also is part of acumen brothers and sisters out there in the world. And so a strategic question I have as a CEO is, what must we control, and where can we just share and let go, given our mission? In terms of finding the entrepreneurs, they find us. Because we've got such strong communities on the ground in each of the countries in which we operate, we get 100 proposals for every one that we would invest in. And so that's been a problem of riches.
Hi. Here.
Hi.
Hi. You've actually touched a few points of what I'm about to ask, but you started off as you are a non-for-profit, but you said you're doing for-profit projects. I wanted to ask, why is that? So what do you think, what do you see the differences are in for-profit impact investment and non-for-profit impact investment?
So
what can you manage to do in one that you can't do in the other one?
So this goes back to the question about with the big boys coming into the sector, is there risk of mission drift? I think one of the big lessons for us is that too often we start with the capital as the end and look for a way to deploy it to make money, rather than start with the solution that we're trying to create, the problem that we're trying to solve, and then identify the type of capital that's needed. So the philanthropy, the philanthropic backed capital, and remember, we're still investing equity and loans in for-profit companies. But the reason that we back it with philanthropy is at early stage market creation, where there's no awareness, there's high corruption, high bureaucracy, and we know we're in for a 10-year fight. That's where we can take risk that nobody else will take. And so it continues to be our most important capital. In the United States, serving these communities that we're looking at with new entrepreneurs, we've only raised philanthropy. In post-conflict Colombia, where farmers groups have been fully isolated from one another and there's very little trust, and even at success, these are going to be subscale in size. We need philanthropic capital to take those risks and build a culture of enterprise and peace. But with energy, once our companies were growing to the point where our $1 million wasn't doing it for them anymore, but the traditional investors still didn't think they were creditworthy enough, in part because they're in rural areas, their customers may make $2 a day, et cetera, that our companies weren't able to get the inventory that the poor were demanding. And so I would literally go visit D-Light or B-Box, another one of our companies, and their warehouses would be empty, and they had all this demand. And we would be at risk, as Francisco knows, losing the company. And so we set up the for-profit initiative so that we could take $5 million bets. And now I really see what patient capital could look like, because I just took a group to Rwanda and Kenya. When we'd go into the warehouses, they were full. And those two companies are now selling, well, they're bringing electricity to 100,000 new people every month. So when you compare that to the grid, it's just mind-boggling. That's where we need the for-profit funds, because the philanthropy comes too slowly. And that's where I hope we can make a contribution, not with judgment, one is better than the other, but the different kinds of capital are so critical for a functioning inclusive capitalism.
Hello, good evening.
Hi.
I wanted to, well, I'm aware that you have your own tools to measure impact, social impact. So my question is, how long does it take normally in the type of projects you invest in to start being able to seeing that social impact, to being able to measure it and provide those numbers, that information to your investors?
Pretty much, I mean, increasingly we're actually looking at doing it during the due diligence. So even before we make the investment, and if our companies don't want to allow us to do that, it tells us a lot about the companies. And the reason for that is we don't necessarily get the deep data in terms of overall impact, but we get an understanding of the entrepreneur's relationship with her customers. So with one of the energy companies that we recently invested in, they told us that they had the best after-sales service reputation in the sector. So once you sell someone their rooftop solar and their television, something will inevitably go wrong, but because you have the phone, do you really show up? In the 2 years ago, we would probably have believed that we would have asked some people, but now we don't. So now we say, do you mind if we just do a lean data study? Because it's so fast, all on text. And we discovered here that he actually had a terrible record. And so then we could talk to him about, do you want to fix this problem or not? So then we could see, was he the kind of entrepreneur that would really work with us to create change? And now we're invested in all is good. But it was, it's right away we start doing lean data now because it is so critical for these companies to actually become viable and for the people to feel their voices are heard. And we're starting to see, going back to this question, from the poor, new products being modified based on what the customers are demanding. And that's really cool.
Hi,
Hi.
Jacqueline. Thank you for being here. I wanted to ask you, are you witnessing a better understanding of social business or a bigger appetite for impact in the newer generation, the millennials?
Since I see a mix of old and new, at risk, I would actually say there's a huge generational gap that is incredibly exciting and hopeful. That I think that people my age still, you know, I went to Stanford Business School, so it was not a mediocre business school. And in our ethics class 25 years ago, we were taught that our ethical responsibility, not our fiduciary responsibility, our ethical responsibility was primacy of the shareholder. And I just gave a speech back at Stanford 25 years later and said, you know, we need a stakeholder model and it's got to come, we've got to see our best business schools in the world taking that on. And everyone in the class and their professors understand that to be true now. Not all of them, but many of them. I think that there's been a real shift, but it's absolutely a generational shift. When you talk to some of the CEOs, and we now work with helping to build companies along the supply chain of Unilever, we're working with IKEA, we're working with a number of Fortune 100 companies. You talk to those CEOs and they can no longer employ people unless they show their own employees that they are not only working on sustainability, but they are being more sustainable. So I think we're going to see new models left, right, and center. But there's still some holding on to the old way of doing things. And it's a very complicated world right now because you see activist investors going after the companies that are trying to make the change, and they're getting caught up as well. So this is where I think that humility is more needed than ever as we're all shouting out at each other, because there's a great wisdom in the older generation and there's great idealism in the younger generation, and we need to find a way to get the best of both.
Hi, Jacqueline. Thanks very much. We feel very lucky and grateful to be here. Can you give us your take? In what way is gender equality introduced as a criteria in your investing decisions? In what way is gender equality introduced as a criteria in your investment decisions? And from a broader perspective, what's your take on gender funds? Thank you.
So, as a woman who started a bank for women 30 years ago, I have to confess that when we started Acumen, everything was so hard that we had no gender lens. We decided that what the countries and the world needed were role models that worked. And some of the women on my board were appalled by that. And what's been fascinating to me, and we still don't have a gender lens in terms of making sure that we're 50-50 entrepreneurs. What we focus on first and foremost is, are we creating models of solutions to poverty that are financially viable, that scale, that serve the poor. What's happened over the last 17 years, however, is that, and I think it's partially our investments in fellows, because our fellows are 50-50 male, female. But they're earlier stage, they're littler companies. What's happened is a couple things. The world has changed radically in the last 15, 17 years. In some companies like D-Light, like you saw Evelyn, who would have not made it onto the map of anything, even 10 years ago, she's going to be an entrepreneur that we may end up investing in. Ethio Chicken has 1,000 employees. 997 of them are Ethiopian. And most of the leaders are women. And so without us really doing much, but possibly because of the kinds of people that we invested in and our fellows program, we now have a very robust pipeline of women entrepreneurs and women within the companies. What we have done and are doing a better job at is helping the companies figure out how better to work with women. In some of the industries in which we work, particularly in Muslim communities, they'll have a training center and expect women to come and stay the night. Not going to happen. So how do you teach your companies how to bring the training to the women? In home health care, you need to have women doctors, or particularly, again, in conservative Muslim communities, the women aren't going to go to you as a doctor. So from a pragmatic perspective, if you just looked at our numbers, you would think that we were like all women all the time, all the way. But the real ugly truth of it is we work in basic services, we work in poverty. Both of those are about women. And our companies are learning very quickly that the best employees they can hire are women. And so I could have just told you a lie, that we come out looking so focused on women, but it's really been the nature of the companies and the people, where I do think we need more focus, and our conversations too often obfuscate that, is on what does it mean to enable the women that you are employing to move up the ranks. That seems to me to be where we're missing. And how do you ensure that your products are being used by women? You can sell women water, clean water, but they will be the last person in the family to drink that water. And so can you have a curiosity that goes beyond checking the box that the women bought the water, because that's actually meaningless. And I think that's where we're getting smarter once we're in.
Hello, Jacqueline. Thank you very much for your presentation.
Thanks.
And congrats for Acumen. You have already presented us a case of you took a company from the health workers and you established this model in Harlem. Have you thought, after these 16 years of your company or of your model of Acumen, have you thought to take the, I don't know, maybe the 5 top successful ideas and settle these ideas all over the world and settle new companies being part of Acumen and try to expand all these ideas that you have seen that they are successful and have a very high social impact to put them in other parts of the world? Thank you.
It's a great question. I heard 2 parts of that, actually. One is actual replication of the companies, and 2 is the sharing of knowledge and communications. And on the replication, it's starting to happen also. And I think that this is, again, where the for-profit funds allow us to both replicate and grow. Because if you look at the solar industry now, it's really moving. And we are helping to share lessons across the sector, and have been invested in most of the companies that you would know in off-grid solar. I think we need to do better, and it's an area of focus for me personally and for the team in terms of sharing lessons on a much broader basis through our online courses and in other ways, case studies too, because we are starting to develop such deep insights, but we haven't really stepped back enough to take those insights and package them in a way that other people can understand and use. And so that's something that's very much on my mind. But so far we haven't said, well, and more organically, we've just been approached in Pakistan because we have a very successful honey company in India. Would you take that model and help us build it? And I think the answer, my team won't be that happy, but for me it will probably be yes. And so I think it's more organic. But for me, more important than actually replicating, again, what do we control and what do we let go, is can we do a better job communicating?
Then I think we are ready with the questions if you have said everything you have inside.
That's a very dangerous thing to say to me. In part, you know, the biggest thing I think we all have inside right now is that we are living in a time of extraordinary turmoil where we feel like we're connected to each other across the globe, and yet we don't know each other. And some of us thought maybe we did know each other better, and that this was going to be such a time of human flourishing. And so the sense of urgency that, you know, you all feel too, or you wouldn't be here, is what keeps me up at night. That how do we get ever more serious, ever more honest, ever more working in partnership and not trying to claim all the credit yourself? Because the world needs us. And those of us who are privileged have more of a responsibility. And if we could somehow change our definition of success from who has the most money to who is creating the most human flourishing, we would have a very different world. And so I just want to thank each of you for the work that you do and for the way you're showing up, and, you know, challenge all of us to ask ourselves daily, what are we doing to not just, you know, make ourselves better, but to enable human dignity in big and small ways. And I especially want to thank you two for this 10-year journey that you've been on with us, and that you're now going on with us. It's just, you make us better, and I just thank you, and I thank you for organizing tonight and for everything that you do and the way that you do it. So.